Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special day-long retreat with Tan Nisabho. So this, whole day actually, we'll be spending some time with Tan Nisabho, learning about engaged Ānāpānasati, engaged mindfulness of breathing. And if you click the description on YouTube and on Facebook, you'll see a schedule for the day. But this morning, we'll begin with taking the 8 precepts. Then Tan Nisabho will share some words of Dhamma, we'll have a break, and then some guided meditation afterwards. And then we'll explain more as the day goes on. So Venerable Nisabho is visiting us from Washington State, where he'll be establishing a new monastery, Clear Mountain Monastery, near Seattle. Is that right? Yeah. And if you'd like more information, you can visit the website that he's created, clearmountainmonastery.org, and you can follow the developments as he establishes a new refuge for Dhamma practice on the West Coast. So good morning so far to Gita, Henley, Denise, Alexandra, Jens, Ron, Aya Vimalanyani, who's very grateful that we organized a Sunday program. And welcome as well to Diane, AC, Edward, KJ, and all others just watching. Feel free at any time to type in a hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. But at this time, I'll pass things over to Tan Nisabho for precepts.
Thank you, Bhante Sumino. And I just want to thank Empty Cloud, Bhante Sudaso, Ayasoma, and the community for having me. And it's been a wonderful few days, and I'll be here for a bit longer as well, a few more weeks. So it's a real pleasure to visit, and it's a really nice community. So I feel very welcome by everyone here and by the electronic community as well somewhat. So yeah, I appreciate everyone joining together. And even in the time of pandemic, it's nice how we can still have this community of practitioners supporting one another. So I think a good way to start these retreats is to take the 8 precepts. So if one isn't comfortable taking a certain thing, then one can just remain silent for that specific precept, but it's encouraged to take them all if one can. So we'll begin by bowing to the Buddha. So we'll now pay homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, and take refuge, and then take the 8 precepts, which are a standard framework we use to hold the space of retreat and practice when we're really dedicating ourselves for the day. So one can repeat after me. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa.
Buddhang saranam gacchami.
Buddhang saranam gacchami.
Dhammang saranam gacchami.
Dhammang saranam gacchami.
Sanghang saranam gacchami.
Sanghang saranam gacchami.
Dutiyampi buddhang saranam gacchami.
Dutiyampi buddhang saranam gacchami.
Dutiyampi dhammang saranam gacchami.
Dutiyampi dhammang saranam gacchami.
Dutiyampi sanghang saranam gacchami.
Dutiyampi sanghang saranam gacchami.
Tatiyampi buddhang saranam gacchami.
Tatiyampi buddhang saranam gacchami.
Tatiyampi dhammang saranam gacchami.
Tatiyampi dhammang saranam gacchami.
Tatiyampi sanghang saranam gacchami.
Tatiyampi sanghang saranam gacchami.
I take refuge in the Buddha.
I take refuge in the Buddha.
I take refuge in the Dhamma.
I take refuge in the Dhamma.
I take refuge in the Sangha.
I take refuge in the Sangha.
For a second time I take refuge in the Buddha.
For a second time I take refuge in the Buddha.
For a second time I take refuge in the Dhamma.
For a second time I take refuge in the Dhamma.
For a second time I take refuge in the Sangha.
For a second time I take refuge in the Sangha.
For a third time I take refuge in the Buddha.
For a third time I take refuge in the Buddha.
For a third time I take refuge in the Dhamma.
For a third time I take refuge in the Dhamma.
For a third time I take refuge in the Sangha.
For a third time I take refuge in the Sangha.
Pangatipata veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Ānāpānasati Sikkhapadang Samadhiyami.
I undertake the precept to refrain from killing.
I undertake the precept to refrain from killing.
Adinadana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Adinadana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
I undertake the precept to not take what is not given.
I undertake the precept to not take what is not given.
Abrahmacharya veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Brahmacharya veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
I undertake the precept to refrain from all sexual conduct.
I undertake the precept to refrain from all sexual conduct.
Musawata veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Musavada veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
I undertake the precept to refrain from lying.
I undertake the precept to refrain from lying.
Sura ameraya majapamadatana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Sura meraya manjapamadatana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
I undertake the precept to refrain from taking intoxicants.
I undertake the precept to refrain from taking intoxicants.
Vikala bhojana ueramani sikaparang samadhiyami.
Vikala bhojana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
I undertake the precept to avoid eating at inappropriate times.
I undertake the precept to avoid eating at inappropriate times.
Nachagita oadita wisukadasana wile kanda malapana dharana mandana vibhusnatana ueramani sikaparang samadhiyami.
Nachagita varita visukadasana malaganda vilepana dharana mandana vibhusanatana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
I undertake the precept to avoid wearing adornments, beautifying the body, and partaking of entertainment.
I undertake the precept to refrain from
Wearing adornments, beautifying the body, or participating in entertainment. Uchat sayana mahasayana ueramani sikaparang samadhiyami.
Uttasayana mahasayana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
I undertake the precept to avoid lying on high or luxurious sleeping places.
I undertake the precept to refrain from lying on high or luxurious sleeping places.
Imani atta sikkhapadani samadhiyami.
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 I undertake these 8 precepts.
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 Imani atta sikkhapadani samadhiyami silena sukating yanti silena boga sampada silena nibuting yanti tasama silang visodaye. These precepts lead to heaven. These precepts lead to wealth. These precepts lead to cessation. And one doesn't have to repeat that. Sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
So, I think we can take heart in having made an aspiration towards keeping this pure, what in Buddhism we call sila, or morality, precepts. It's traditionally referred to as mahadana in Buddhism, which means a great gift. And whereas in our Puritan culture, we can look at precepts or restraint around action in the light of our puritanical history. And it can seem one more ascetic practice, something life-deadening. But what it really is a gift to everyone around us that says, I will not hurt you. I will not take from you. I will not harm through sexual misconduct with regard to the 5 precepts, and with regard to the 8 we just took, it goes even deeper, saying that in this moment I will interact with all beings just as beings subject to suffering with the potential for liberation, rather than as sexual objects. It's a gift when we tell someone and when they know that we will never lie to them. And when they also know that we will be able to protect all of these intentions, because we won't compromise our own sense of restraint and mindfulness by taking intoxicants. So those 5, the 5 basic precepts, are a gift that the Buddha granted us to give to those around us. And the 3 subsequent precepts in the 8 of not eating at inappropriate times, of not adorning the body or beautifying it or participating in entertainment, taking in entertainment, or lying on high luxurious sleeping places, not indulging in sleep, are ways of giving ourselves even more to the practice. When one doesn't eat in the afternoon, just takes a bit of sugar or juice, then in the evening the body is much lighter for meditation. And also, one doesn't have to spend time preparing a meal. One can really just focus on practice. And when one turns off the phone and tries to avoid entertainment for the day, then one's intention doesn't become fractured, and one can keep the intention and trajectory of the day and of their goal pure, just to practice and to purify the heart for that long. And when one avoids indulging in sleep, then one is devoted to wakefulness and willing to put in the extra effort of centering, calming, and clarifying the mind for that time. And those 3 in their own represent a great gift, because this practice and this time that you have come to spend with us in retreat is the greatest of all gifts that one can give to the world. And this is difficult to convey to people who haven't practiced before. They see you leaving the party a bit earlier to go home and sit, or retreating from conversation at times to just be quiet, going on retreat for a day rather than going out or seeing a movie together. And people can perceive it as a pulling away, and a confusing one at that, because what are you doing in your room, alone, quiet, staring at your belly button? But this comes from not understanding that when we establish a still point at the center of our lives, it is the wellspring from which all action emerges and becomes potentized. And if we cultivate this anchor in our days, then the heart becomes steadily illuminated as life goes on. And every word we say and every action we undertake becomes infused with meaning and purpose. Then every action in life becomes yet another adornment of the mind, and there are no meaningless actions. Then even the difficult and fracturing nature of a life overburdened with duties and caught between various distractions takes on one single movement towards awakening and purification of the mind and heart, because every action is looked at as just one more tool to serve in that goal, on that path. But to maintain that perspective throughout a day, we have to anchor ourselves through meditation and the chance to take periods of time out of the week or the month to really recenter and give ourselves to practice and remind ourselves what is the most important thing in our lives, what is our ultimate responsibility. And that is to awakening. We were not given these lives for nothing. And unless we continually reaffirm through action and the gift of time and attention our true purpose and our true duty to not only ourselves and the world, but everyone around us, then we risk forgetting it. So coming here and spending time is a great gift, because those around you, even those who don't understand what you're doing in your room or staying home, it still can slowly sink in to those around you what you're affirming through your action and gift of time, which is the existence and the utter importance and significance of the ultimate goal of the human spirit, which is to dedicate itself to awakening, to seeing truth, to eliminating defilement, and to over time shaping ourselves into vessels of compassion for this world, which so needs it. And that cannot be done without training, discipline, and a daily practice. So these three final precepts are also a great gift because they frame this space and this time in a way that allows one to aim intentionally and purely at the ultimate goal of the Buddhist path for a time. Ajahn Chah used to say, the teacher in the lineage I ordained in, that the Uposatha days, which are the full moon and new moon days, which occur every 2 weeks. Additionally, the small Uposatha days, which are the half moons. He said, these are the 4 Buddha days, and you get another 26 normal days, but you have to give these 4 days to the Buddha. And I like that a lot. So today is a day we give to what the Buddha represents, awakening the purified heart. And what we're going to look at today is the Ānāpānasati Sutta, Mindfulness of Breathing. So this sutta is one of the, actually before we do, I think it's worth stopping for a second and setting intention around loving kindness. So as I'm speaking in general, in our tradition, you're welcome to just meditate and close your eyes. But let's all do that very intentionally now. So I'd allow in the sounds around you. Just relax. And take this moment to let the difficulties and stressors of the last week, and maybe much longer, rest for a little bit. And to acknowledge how heavy a weight we tend to carry every day in our duties to others, trying to make ends meet, in the inevitable tempest of conditions which bombard us every day in work, with family, how we find ourselves a disappointment sometimes, how we have 100 things we know we need to let go of but can't. And just to have compassion for that situation, for ourselves for a second, just a second, give yourselves that. Because we usually shoulder these burdens day after day, and we never take a second to stop and let them speak in their small and quiet voice, which is also the voice of our better nature. So now just turn your mind briefly to your heart and let it crack open just a little bit and tell you how hard, perhaps, this last period has been and what weights it's been carrying and how it's been trying its best to keep up, but that it is hard. And thank it for that. Thank yourself for that. And take a second to really rejoice, to really take pride, a wholesome pride in the fact that you've managed to come and set aside time to do something that so few people do. That you want truly the best for yourself and those around you, such that you are willing to take a step out of the daily life and duties and devote yourself to practice. And that this is a huge gift. And just let yourself rest in that knowledge and pride, or at least a sense of self-worth coming from that, because it is deserved. And now bring to mind the face of someone who cares for you, especially someone, if you can remember, who did something for you completely out of the blue, completely selflessly, and gave you a gift. And imagine them looking at you with that gaze of kindness. And feel that. Modern people have a great deal of trouble feeling compassion for themselves. But imagine this other person close to you having that compassion for you, and touch into what that would be like for them towards you. And this is the back door to caring for yourself again. And label it with a word if you can. What's that feeling? Is it love? Is it kindness? Is it sweetness? Is it care, sympathy? Is it a laughing kind of care in the best sense? Is it just listening? And let that warmth in the heart grow. Just from that, let the feeling quality grow. And you can either keep that image in mind of the person who cares for you, looking at you with kindness, or that moment when they gave to you, or the word, or just the feeling itself. But cultivate for a second that warmth in the heart of love and compassion to yourself. And let the heart be with that for just a second, for just this time. We travel for years without giving ourselves this much. We wander in the desert for whole lifetimes without giving ourselves this much credit. So allow yourself that for a second. It's not selfish. The heart has usually come out of past years bruised and bombarded. And in modern culture, that is no small thing. And this is what the Buddhist admonition towards silence allows, is the directive of the first noble truth, so misleadingly translated as life is suffering, where it would be much better looked at as the directive associated with it to turn towards and comprehend our suffering and our pain. And this is the first step towards grace. There's no neutral stance towards dukkha, stress. You're either turning towards it intentionally with careful hands, or you're running from it. There's no neutral place. I'm reminded of a story of Chogyam Trungpa, a teacher who came from Tibet. And he was touring monasteries as a child or as a young man in Tibet. And these monasteries are guarded by gigantic Tibetan mastiffs chained to stakes in the ground. And on one of these trips, him and the entourage of lamas he was with and came to a new monastery, and the mastiff broke from its chains and it ran at them, and everyone scattered except for Chogyam Trungpa, who ran straight at the mastiff, and it got so scared that it ran away from him. And this is the deal when we run into the wind of our suffering, and it's the only way. And it's why the Buddha set up so many structures and so many teachings to allow us to turn towards it, because it takes a huge act of spirit to do so. And yet it is the only safe place to turn towards our pain, because if we are not doing that, then we are running headlong away from it and fracturing ourselves in the attempt to escape. And I remember for myself in college, right after college, I was driving down the coast of California, looking into grad schools, and over the past few years of university, the different distractions and ways I had of trying to entertain myself had slowly accumulated to the point where I was constantly looking for a way to escape or to distract myself. And this really had culminated by the end of college, where I just remember driving down the 101 or the road slightly inland of that, and listening to podcast after podcast and stopping and reading The Hunger Games and going to a movie and stopping at Taco Bell, and just the ceaseless trying to distract myself from whatever it was that was chasing me. And then I remember stepping into a Abhayagiri monastery, the monastery in Northern California where I've spent some time and where Bhante Sudaso ordained. And I remember encountering suddenly this deep quiet, and how I knew in that moment that that's what I needed to turn towards my pain and my suffering, and to make the quintessential motion of the heart which would make my life worthy of my death. And that meant steering it towards suffering and towards awakening, because they are the same in terms of the initial direction of the heart. When one turns towards and looks at one's suffering, only then can one comprehend it, let go of its source or cause craving, realize its cessation, and practice the path to that cessation. So in this moment, and in these moments of practice, this is when we have the chance to turn towards and lay our hands on that pain, which is so constant in our lives, even at a subtle level. And there's a teacher who was giving a talk in Sandpoint, Idaho, near where I grew up. And he was talking about the first noble truth, to look at one's suffering. And a man in the audience chimed in and said, "Oh, it's like telephone poles." And this teacher looked at the man in askance and said, "What do you mean?" And the man said, "I used to work putting in telephone poles to the ground, like installing them. And they're really unstable when they initially put them in. And the initial idea is that if they fall, you just want to run as fast as you can the other way. But my foreman told me that if that pole falls or begins to fall, the only safe place is right up next to it with your hands pressed against it. Because then you can feel it move and see which way it's going to topple. And in the same way, the only safe place in this life is with our hands laid carefully and steadily against our own pain, checking in on a regular basis and giving ourselves that space. Because if we don't allow that, then we're running the other way, and that is not a safe place to be. So this can be your telephone pole day initially. And I know this talk isn't yet on mindfulness of breathing, but that's part of the point, is that these practices can become one more technique in our arsenal, one more thing to do. And that subtle drive to do, to move, to escape, is driven by that same impulse to run from the mastiff, to distract ourselves, to make things right. So just take a second and don't try to make things right. And just see how the heart is cracked and be with that. Because it is only through that heart's cracking that it becomes open to the world and a vessel of compassion. So the rest of this day and the unbelievably nuanced instructions the Buddha laid out for mindfulness of breathing don't become one more way of running. So this is the important point from which we begin. So let's just rest in that for a time. And if one cultivates this sense of warmth towards oneself, then instead of spreading it out, which tends to dilute it and weaken it, instead bring people into it. Think of someone you care for and shrink them. It sounds funny, but it works. This is an advice from Longpo Pasano, and I find it extremely effective. Shrink them down and bring them into your heart rather than sending the metta out. Bring them into the field of your heart, into that warmth and that space of caring. And let them be there for a time, just with you. And Bhante Sudasi used an image I really appreciated several days ago. It's as if you're in a house with the shutters closed and there's a storm raging outside, but inside it's warm and bright and there's nothing to do except wait out the storm in safety and warmth. And that's what this place is in our heart right now. You can even offer these small people cups of hot cocoa if you want. Welcome them in. There's enough space. My teacher, Ajahn Anand, says to begin every meditation session, especially for Westerners, with 10 minutes of loving kindness. So I figure a day-long retreat, it couldn't hurt beginning with 30. But this is not some small thing we add at the end. This is a basic intention. And it's important to see that the Four Noble Truths are ordered as they are for several reasons. It echoes Ayurvedic medicine, but also it can be looked at as the progression through which we can approach the path most skillfully. So first we look and comprehend our own suffering. We see the craving and we let it go. We experience a level of peace as we set these things down. And then from that place of quiet and calm, then we cultivate the path in detail. So let's just sit with loving kindness for another 10 minutes. So let's take a second before we finish this meditation session and just dedicate the goodness, the care, and the warmth of this last 45 minutes to all beings, to those in your life who need it, who are struggling, to your own future and well-being. To all those around you, your family, and also the goodness from the day to come of practice, dedicated to those who have passed, who have left us, and realize that this time is not just for you. You may be sitting alone in your house, but this practice is in the service of something much, much greater. And it is the greatest gift that you can give to those you love. So we'll take a 15-minute break, and then we'll gather again, and I'll actually talk about the subject of what today was supposed to be about, the breath. It's okay.
Dhammakataya sadhukaram banamase.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. So hopefully you had some time for a tea break, restroom break, brain break. And at this time, I'll pass things back over to Tan Nisabho, who will guide us in some meditation.
Great. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So today's topic is engaged breath meditation, the Ānāpānasati Sutta. And this sutta is one of the seminal suttas in the Buddhist canon. It's profoundly useful. And the Buddha frequently spoke of breath meditation with a special attention. He spoke of breath meditation as the abode of the Tathagata, which was his epithet for himself. So it was a meditation object especially of interest to him, and one that he recommended for his practitioners and followers as well. And there's a famous sutta called the Aritta Sutta. Actually, it's not so famous. It's almost no one knows it now that I think about it, which is perhaps the problem, because in it, I think it speaks to how breath meditation has been so mistaught in the West. In it, the Buddha asks the monks how they practice breath meditation. And a well-meaning young monk named Venerable Aritta chimes in and says, well, Bhante, put aside thoughts of the past and thoughts of the future, and mindfully I breathe in, mindfully I breathe out. And the Buddha kind of nods and rolls his eyes and says, yes, Venerable Aritta, that is mindfulness of breathing, I don't deny it, but as to how mindfulness of breathing is practiced in full, listen and I will speak. And then he teaches the Ānāpānasati Sutta, the mindfulness of breathing sutta with 16 steps, or the equivalent of it in this other sutta. So one of the great disservices that Western tradition and the Western transmission of Buddhism has done is simplify mindfulness of breathing to just the instruction to try to be aware of the breath at the tip of the nose and not control it, and with the assumption that this will be enough to calm the modern monkey mind. And for some it is, but for many it's not. And there's several problems. One is that the modern mind is extremely active, and we are creatures that are in the habit of doing, and we are bound with intention and in the habit of creating intention constantly. And if we come to a meditation after a day of work and being with our family and taking care of duties, and then tell ourselves to just remain with the breath at one point and to not control it, it's a bit like telling a classroom of screaming second graders to sit down and take a test. It doesn't work. Or sometimes it doesn't work. And much better to work with the energy of the mind, to work with the energy of that classroom of rowdy toddlers, and let them run around outside and maybe do a team builder, do something wholesome, collect samples from a pond, and then gather back. And once they've run a bit of their energy out, then to establish awareness at a more focused point. And if we just tell ourselves to not control the breath at all right from the beginning, then this intention to control tends to move into a subterranean level. And it still operates, but it just clenches things. And this is when the breath can get tight and things get very confused and forced. So it can be better to work with that tendency to control at the beginning and to use it in the service of skillful exploration of the breath and of the body. And then once that tendency to control has calmed a bit, then to come to one spot. So the Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta begins with the instruction to set one's body erect. And one can begin doing this by drawing the pelvis in and the lumbar in, and then moving one vertebrae at a time up the spine, stringing the backbone erect like a string of pearls resting one on top of another, to the point where it feels like out of the crown of the head there's a thin string suspending the body. And one dips the chin slightly, softens the neck, widens the chest. Intuitively, one can just think of sitting with dignity. And the sutta begins by saying one sets the body erect and brings mindfulness to the fore. And the first steps of these 16 steps begin with a very simple instruction. But before we go into that, there's a prelude to the sutta, which speaks about how when one fulfills the 16 steps of breath meditation, one fulfills the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And those 4 foundations, briefly, are, and most of you may be familiar with them, mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of mind, and mindfulness of dhammas, which is variously translated as phenomena, or I appreciate the term Dhamma categories. It can be looked at as taking our experience and applying the framework of the Buddha's teachings to it, specifically classifying phenomena in the mind in terms of the 5 hindrances and the 7 enlightenment factors. So there's 4 groups of 4 in these 16 steps, and each group is referred to as a tetrad. So the first tetrad, the first 4 steps, correspond to mindfulness of the body. The second tetrad correspond to mindfulness of feelings. The third to mindfulness of mind, and the fourth to mindfulness of dhammas. And the sutta goes on to say that when one has cultivated these 4 foundations of mindfulness, one also cultivates the 7 awakening factors. And eventually one can achieve liberation of heart through this practice. So the first step is to, after setting one's body erect and bringing mindfulness to the fore, to mindfully breathing in, one knows. Mindfully breathing in long, one knows I breathe in long. Mindfully breathing out long, one knows I breathe out long. Mindfully breathing in short, one knows I breathe in short. Mindfully breathing out short, one knows I breathe out short. And in these first 2 steps, the exhalation and inhalation each account just for 1. So these are just 2 of the 16. One is carefully anchoring the mind at the beginning of the practice by noting the length of the breath. And this allows one to carefully keep track of the length and weight of one's breathing and see very clearly when the mind has strayed, because one is analyzing the breath as one breathes. So it's an initial way to anchor the mind in the practice. And this is where one can use that tendency to control the breath to one's own benefit. So seeing how the breath feels. Does a long breath feel better? Or does a short breath feel better? Or does a long exhalation and a short exhalation? So one adjusts the breath to feel comfortable. And initially, 3 deep breaths can really help calm the mind. And with Westerners or modern meditators, when using thought to adjust one's breathing, we tend to be so overbearing by nature that speaking to ourselves with instructions tends to be too violent. So a skillful means is to use thought to ask oneself questions and direct the mind, phrasing instructions as questions. So asking, how can I breathe most comfortably? What kind of breath feels the best? Where do I feel the breath now? Something like that. Find a phrase that's a question. And the chitta, the mind and heart and the body will respond naturally and gently to that sort of direction. So one stays with these initial steps at first, anchoring the mind, and when the mind wanders, bringing it back to this sensation of the breath and the noting of its length, gently and smilingly, like someone herding a puppy back to its proper place of play. And long and short breaths in these first 2 steps can also be interpreted in terms of comfortable and uncomfortable, heavy and light. Use these first 2 steps to understand how one can breathe to calm the body. And where we, in the initial prelude to these steps, cultivated mindfulness by bringing it to the fore, this aspect of analyzing the breath fulfills the second enlightenment factor of Dhammavichaya, investigation of Dhammas, investigating the breath. So in many cases, this is where modern interpretations of breath meditation halt. One becomes aware of the breath and just stays there. But the Buddha had another 14 steps. And the next one is both extremely important and has been a subject of controversy for a long time. The instruction is to, one trains thus: breathing in, I will remain sensitive to the whole body. Breathing out, I will remain sensitive to the whole body. And this term sabakaya, whole body, has been interpreted since many centuries ago, actually, since the commentaries, as the whole body of the breath at the tip of the nose. And there's validity to that in certain ways. And certainly some later on in a meditation or when the mind is calm, then tracking the breath at the tip of the nose as one would a silk thread continuously can be very helpful. But increasingly, scholarship by Bhante Analayo, Longpo Sucitto, Ajahn Jeff, and many of the other teachers in terms of their practice who I've encountered have pointed to the fact that, and just to be clear, many of these are the way I've worked with the sutta. I believe that Bhante Sudaso will also be speaking on it later in this week, and it's a profoundly deep sutta, and there are different ways of looking at all these things. So hold what I say lightly and only in service of one's practice. This is just what's helped me with it, and it'll be useful to get multiple perspectives. But this whole body, in the interpretation of these teachers, means literally just that, the whole body. And in ancient Buddhist thought, pana, or the breath, prana in Sanskrit, or chi in Chinese thought, and Taoist conception, isn't just the coarse wind at the nostrils, but rather the subtle energy that runs through the whole body. And when one becomes aware of the whole body, then one becomes aware of this circulating subtle energy through the entire body. So specifically, the chi, or subtle energy, tends to run down two main meridians, down the front of the body and then up the spine. Or one can trace it down the spine and up the front of the body. And it has other motions as well, but this is one of the sort of quintessential circuits of the main force of that energy. And as modern people, we're so alienated from our bodies, stuck in our heads. As Ajahn Amaro says, we tend to conceive of the body as something that keeps our necks from dragging on the ground. And we've forgotten our bodies are somewhat traumatized, and we are constantly have a tightness in our diaphragms that forces awareness into the head, and which is where we inhabit most of our world or our lives. So a big part of this practice is initially dropping awareness into the torso, where the somatic sense in the heart resides, and where one can gain access to the sensitivity towards the whole body of the breath, sabakaya. So frequently for modern people, an expedient means is useful before meditation. So Qigong is used by many practitioners. Longpo Sucitto teaches it at the beginning of every retreat. I recommend the 5 basic standing poses outlined in the Way of Energy. Additionally, I recommend this, but no one else seems to take me up on it, is cold showers. Very helpful. So if you're brave, do that. It'll clarify the energy. We have monks shaking their heads in the background. It's very helpful. If any of you do that in the 2 p.m. session, let me know, okay? Exercise is helpful, and certain yogic techniques as well. But finding some way to drop the awareness into the torso. And there are visualizations to do this initially as well. Tan Lee, a famous master of the Thai forest tradition, began by speaking about using the breath energy. He was one of the first to popularize this, or repopularize, because I believe the Buddha was one of the first to popularize this technique. But to speak again to this technique by initially beginning breath meditation, by imagining white light streaming down through the crown of the head, down the side of the body, to the feet, and out the left foot, and then up the right foot, up the side of the body, and up through the top of the head. And I believe that that is the circuit that women use, if I'm remembering appropriately, whereas this teacher recommends men do the circuit the opposite way. I've never found there to be a big difference, but I'm not, I haven't been a woman, so I don't know. But I feel like I should at least convey those instructions. And similarly, one can initially imagine a warm butter or something similar melting over the head and down the neck, coursing it down to the chest area, But these are all helpful visualizations for the active mind. This is equivalent to letting the classroom of rowdy kids run around for a bit. The most basic technique, and the one I find that is the most helpful, is to divide the body into 3 chambers. So initially one establishes a chamber around the head area and the neck. The second chamber is around the torso. And the third is around what Taoist thought refers to as the dantian, right below the navel. And one initially begins by establishing awareness in this upper chamber and breathing for a time. And after a while, one will sense a certain flavor when awareness is placed there. And then either one will lose interest or the awareness will naturally drop, especially if the chin is kept slightly lowered to the heart area. And one remains there for a while, breathing and sensing the different sensations. And then when one loses interest or the body naturally allows the awareness to drop once more into the torso, diaphragm, and tailbone area. And one breathes there for a time. And when one is finished with that lowest chamber, one expands awareness to encompass the entire body from the tailbone to the crown of the head, and breathes encompassing the whole body in one's awareness for a time. And then one repeats this circuit, allowing the mind to move through it little by little and sensitize oneself to each area of the body. And as one moves through these different chambers, one can bring awareness to the left, right, and middle of each chamber. And one will usually find that one side of one's body is numb and the other side is quite sensitive. So little by little, one can imagine or establish awareness more and more with a bit more focus on the numb side. And over days and months and years, one will rebalance the body. And when the mind is active, it can be very useful to bring in other visualizations to this technique. So each chamber one can visualize as a rough chamber, and the breath is a white, bright mist. And as one breathes, the mist comes in and out of the chamber, or as a circle of bright light, which expands and contracts with the breath. And one moves that bright light down through each chamber and then expands to encompass it all. And initially, this will begin to rebalance the body. Instead of just being stuck in the head, one begins to gain awareness of the lower realms of the torso, and somatic sense becomes reconstituted. One is reacquainting oneself with one's body. And we tend not to just be alienated from the lower half of our bodies, but also from the back. So it can be very helpful to imagine that bright white mist coming in with the breath through the shoulder blades and coming in with the breath through the kidneys. And one will find that as one uses and visualizes the breath in this way, that parts of the body that have been dry and starved for energy for sometimes years begin to be nourished again. There is one of the beauties of the Ānāpānasati Sutta is that it's overlaid by several other suttas. So a direct overlay is the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which we've spoken of, in that each tetrad, each 4 steps of the Ānāpānasati Sutta corresponds to one of the foundations of mindfulness. At the moment we're moving through the mindfulness of the body. But the Buddha also spoke of 4 jhanas and 4 analogies or images for those jhanas. And these 2 suttas don't overlay perfectly with the Ānāpānasati Sutta, but they do have resonances with the tetrads as well. So just to be clear, when one has moved through the first 4 steps of the Ānāpānasati Sutta, it does not mean that one has attained first jhana. But the image is useful. The first jhana is described by the Buddha as secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states. One enters, abides in the first jhana, rapture and pleasure, born of seclusion, accompanied by applied and sustained thought. Now, this applied and sustained thought, which is in Pali referred to as vitakka vichara, is the active motions of the mind. It's compared in the commentaries to ringing a bell, vitakka, applying attention, and then vichara is the tasting or listening to that sound of the bell, evaluating what the initial intention has catalyzed. And with these visualizations and use of perception, say of moving the awareness through the body, or visualizing this white mist, or using any of these visualizations, this is the use of vitakka. We are applying a perception, and then we're seeing how it feels, what it initiates. We're listening to the ring. And the analogy the Buddha applied or spoke of in terms of the first jhana was that of a bathman's or a bathman's apprentice kneading a ball of bath powder with water so that no part of that ball of bath powder would be unpervaded by the cool moisture of that water. In just the same way, a meditator kneads and pervades this body with the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. So here the Buddha is speaking of this process of kneading the breath energy, this subtle nourishment into the whole body. And the hands of the bathman that are kneading this nourishment in, this is vitakka vichara, directed thought and evaluation. So it's active. And this is what we're doing when we apply these visualizations or this movement of the mind, is we are actively kneading in and re-nourishing all these deadened parts of our body. So this initial stage can be quite active if one wants it to be. And if one's feeling calm and feels like settling just at one spot, then that's just fine. But if one finds that the classrooms of second graders is still pretty rowdy, then letting them run around the body for a while in this circuit, like a dog circling the bed before it lies down finally, can be very helpful. And as one does that, one gains great sensitivity to the breath energy and learns how to use it well and skillfully. So one will begin to detect different resonances. In the head, there tends to be a light flavor of this nourishment that comes from above. Whereas down below in the lower regions, there tends to be a very robust nourishment that comes from the ground. And as one moves through these circuits repeatedly, eventually the mind will calm down. And when that happens, one finds one spot in the body, frequently the tip of the nose, where the breath feels especially prominent and rests there with the breath, like a spider at the center of a web, in one spot, but still sensitive to the entire web. So just so one would bring one's attention to one spot and rest there, but remain sensitive to this whole field of the body that had been cultivated. And when one does this, one begins to be aware of this subtle motion of the breath energy down the front and up the spine, or down the spine and up the front. And can just rest in that, tracking the breath at the nose, but also, or alternately, remaining aware of the breath as a subtle energy that moves through the whole body. Or, yes, so And this is a useful recollection. And it also allows us to use the breath energy in other ways. If there's pain in certain parts of the body or a tightness, then one can begin to learn to relax that. So one can find where these knots are in the body. The next step of this tetrad is to breathe in and out, calming the bodily fabrication, what they call mental kaya sankhara. And kaya sankhara can be conceptualized as a few different things. One is these knots in the body, these traumatic points in the breath body, which we may be completely unaware of until we begin to cultivate awareness of this body. So frequently people have a knot in the throat or a knot of fear perpetually in the chest. And as one becomes sensitive to the entirety of the body, one begins to become aware of these blockages in this flow of energy. And one can either allow just the natural circling of the mind and sensitivity to calm these things of their own accord, or one can very consciously visualize the breath as light moving through them and relaxing them, or just bring the mind to them with a gentle touch until they slowly relax. And as one does this, one calms these kaya sankhara, these bodily fabrications, and the natural flow of the breath energy along these meridians becomes apparent and accessible and nourishing. And the other interpretation of bodily fabrication is just the in and out breathing. And as one begins to become sensitive to the breath energy, then the motion of the breath becomes less tethered to the coarse billowing of the lungs in and out. And one brings one's attention more and more to those points between the inhale and exhale, and notices that even there's a subtle expansion and contraction of energy. And one can allow that motion of the lungs and of the expansion and contraction of the belly to soften and become more subtle, and allow the breath to course and circulate of its own accord. One can take note of where one is squeezing the body and the lungs to make the breath function, and realize that one doesn't have to. Consciously calming and allowing those motions to slowly cease, or at least become more subtle, so that the breath actually becomes very still, and one becomes increasingly aware of it as simply this energy, nourishing and bright, moving through the whole body. And when one has done this for a time, the mind can begin to move, and one can come again back to the initial steps. This isn't a completely linear progression, so one might find oneself in need of noting just the length of the breath again, or remaining with the breath specifically at the nose, or expanding to encompass the whole body. I find that the mind tends to oscillate between one point and the whole until eventually they merge. But this is not some esoteric technique, and it's not an academic practice. The reacquaintance of oneself with their body means that one is reacquainting oneself with the natural home of the chitta, what in Pali means the mind and heart. And only by reaccessing that by reacquainting oneself with these subtle and forgotten energies that reside in the body as opposed to just the head, can one begin to access the profound nourishing power of the breath and the breath energy, and with one's deepest and most authentic voice and intuition. So this is just the first tetrad, but the first 4 steps of the 16, the first of the 4 foundations. But if cultivated in this engaged and active way, then one can become very skilled at using this breath energy, and one can learn to nourish the body and gain a huge wellspring of well-being. And if one does that, then all meditation objects, such as loving kindness and other more ones based on visualization or the cultivation of a certain feeling or recollection, become much more potent because they are fueled by a profound sense of unification of mind, heart, and body, which is cultivated through this practice of Ānāpānasati. So we'll continue, I believe, later in the afternoon, and we can move into the other steps, though I'm not sure we'll hit all 16, but we'll move into some of the later areas of this sutta and all of its implications. But to be honest, these first 4 are worthy of years of practice on their own. And you should all take cold showers if you can. Okay.
Handamayam Dhammakataya Sadhukaram Ladamase.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
So thanks everyone for joining us for this morning session of the day-long retreat with Tan Nisabho. So at this time we have a break, so you're free to take care of some silent chores, prepare lunch, etc. And we'll meet back here again at 2 p.m. for a Dhamma Talk and Q&A. So if you have any questions from this morning session, keep track of them and save them for the afternoon session, which begins at 2 p.m. New York City time. So hopefully we can see you all then, and enjoy the rest of your morning.